Good evening to everybody. I'm sorry we're starting a bit late, but as you will have seen, those who had started off or took the initiative this morning to do what we were doing this morning were a bit late themselves, and they made the request for the room late, and so the whole thing is taken with a time lag. So the idea was that if people speak in other languages and you want to hear Italian, put your little pointer onto 4 and you will hear Italian. But anyway, a slight change in the program. It's been turned around because our colleague Marietta Shaka has got to go to plenary to speak there, so I'll make a very brief introduction before giving the floor to Marietta. Anyway, thank you for coming. She's very much swayed by issues of communication and media. She's in ALDE, but not just that, in the Culture Committee as well. But we've been looking at this since last year, since the group was set up. We've been looking at information, and we think it's absolutely of fundamental importance. This is not just any old topic, which just happens to be of interest now in Italy, but I think pretty much throughout Europe it's a crucial issue. It's right and proper we should have politics and formation of public opinion, but for that you need good information to the electorate to have analysis so that they can cast their vote properly and give an informed opinion via their vote. But at the moment there's an information deficit, and soon we'll be looking at the various causes for this. I'd like to thank David Coretta, who accepted our invitation to come as one of the best Italian journalists. I say that, but I think it's universally recognized. For the level of information which he disseminates from the European Parliament to Italy, and in his report he will cover journalistic deontology, how a journalist can react to reality, to political power, and maintain their dignity, and give sufficient, adequate information, proper information, very often the news is skewed by people who own media and also journalists themselves, so it behoves journalists to give independent information. So I'd like to thank Natalie Griesbeck as well for coming and give her the floor later on, but having thanked her, and I'd like also to thank Marietta Shaka for coming, and she has to go to plenary now, so I'll give you the floor now.
A lot of you speak Italian, so let me just allow you to tune into the Italian channel for a little bit, and in the meantime specifically welcome some guests that we have here today, who are 4 interns that are with us for a week to learn about the workings of the European Parliament. They're still in school, and it might be a good moment to highlight the fact that we liberals believe that both education and press freedom, freedom of expression, are really fundamental pillars of democracies. we see the EU as a community of values, and it may come as no surprise to you that when we talk about the EU as a global player and as an entity that should defend freedom of expression, fundamental freedoms, human rights, we often get the question, well, what about Italy? How is the situation inside the EU? How can you talk to countries like Iran, like Egypt, like China with any credibility when the standards of freedom of expression, access to information, press independence are so dire in a country like Italy, which is a member state of the EU? And I'm proud to say that our colleagues in the liberal group are really staunch defenders of this freedom. And of course there are opportunities to be taken. It's a very difficult situation, a lot has been tried, but I want to have a positive message because I do think that there are new opportunities that specifically come with the existence of new technologies and new media, such as the internet. We still see that media ownership, media control, laws about journalism, access to information, freedom of expression are much controlled on a national level. And contrary to that, we see a global web, the World Wide Web, which is called the internet. So this really allows us to connect as citizens in a very low threshold way, independently of these media conglomerates, of these established institutions of communication and information. And I think that this is really an opportunity that would be very useful for Italian people to take. I was in Italy last year to talk in the Italian Senate about secularism. Very interesting combination, but there were a number of young people who asked me also about what the European Parliament thinks about press freedom and freedom of expression. We had just had a vote here in the European Parliament, which was a difficult one, where we had strived for more European interference with the situation in Italy, but the more conservative forces of this House had managed to block this European interference. And so many young Italian people asked, what can we do? You know, now that the European Parliament hasn't been able to allow for top-down interference, does this mean we're stuck in the situation we are? And I said, not really, because I think you can take the opportunities that new media bring, you know, start a Facebook group and gather people around you, because these new technologies offer opening of barriers, more communications, more transparency, more freedom of expression, but of course they are still in the hands of people, and it's people that have to come up with the inspiration to change the status quo, to connect with each other, and to really make the difference. And this new media aspect touches upon a revolution in media and communications, but it touches on many, many other subjects. And that's why here in the European Parliament we approach this as a horizontal issue. I've founded a group called the New Media Intergroup, which is a network of members of the Parliament, members of civil society, of the business world, simply people who are interested to connect with each other and to look at what opportunities these new media bring and what we can do with it in a variety of aspects, because we have to make sure that we don't get caught in a tunnel or in a compartment of one subject, because we see the same with press freedom and freedom of expression. It's not only about this topic, but it's also about ownership, about state aid, about the rules that govern our economy, that affect the freedoms that people have. So if we want to make sure that these freedoms are guaranteed in the most wide way, we also have to look at the widest scope of spheres of influence on these freedoms or the challenges to them. So let me end there and allow for room for our other speakers, and just leave you with the thought that even if the institutions of media are very difficult in Italy, I think new media offers the most opportunities for a breakthrough from the bottom up, driven by citizens, driven by journalists, and the World Wide Web allows for global connection also to us here in the European Parliament and to like-minded people who really want to make a difference. And you can trust on the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats for Europe to be there to be an advocate of the most far-reaching freedom of expression and press freedom. Thank you.
Grazie, Marieke.
Just want to say that attention to European news, and that in Italy as well, goes through the new media vectors, but TV, which is the strongest vector, is a problem for everybody. Not later than Sunday, I got a visit from the second Dutch channel, TV people coming to do a report on European policy and the phenomenon of Berlusconi, because they couldn't understand why Berlusconi had an image throughout Europe, but in Italy, nevertheless, was getting a consensus of support and seen in perhaps a different way. So I'll touch upon that in my report, so I won't jump the gun on it. But I'd like to thank Marietta for who has to go, and thank you for what you said.
Ci ha raggiunto Sylvie Goulard, che
Sylvie has come, and working on a very important topic. So Sylvie Goulard, if you want to say something, you'll be welcome, but if you want to speak later on, you'll be also welcome.
I'll speak French. Once again, there are colleagues from the relevant committees here who are better informed on this, better equipped than I am, but when I was asked by Giommaria to support this initiative, I said yes, because I think press freedom, I believe press freedom is precious, both on the big issues, the big themes, like respect for rights and so on, but also if you look at how we operate here, how Europe works, an issue I'm dealing with is economic governance, along with others, of course. And on that subject, we are finding it difficult to get across the message that the European Parliament plays a role in this. It's absolutely extraordinary. 1 year after the Treaty of Lisbon, governments, Mrs. Merkel, Mr. Sarkozy, Mr. Berlusconi, signed and ratified that treaty, but don't seem to want to accept the consequences. So we don't have a proper debate on Europe. I have a lot of time for Italy. I think what is happening is very worrying, but France should not be teaching anyone any lessons on this. We have our own problems, conflict of interest between ministries at the highest level. There are campaigns and trials against journalists which are possibly anti-constitutional. So there are various issues. This is a very fragile freedom. Thank you.
Grazie, grazie Sylvie.
Well, thank you to you, Sylvie. Before giving the floor to David Carretta, I'd just like to use the fact that Sylvie is with us to tell you about something which happened. Last spring, there were regional elections in France and in Italy, a month between them. In a culturally similar situation where the centre-right and the government, well, the majority, Sarkozy, was fairly low on the polls, we got the French regional elections, which saw a victory, pretty much total wipeout victory of the centre-left in Alsace. I think it was a victory of the centre-right, but in a month, the centre-right won in 6 regions out of 10, and in the most important ones. But the cultural context was the same or similar. So I had to try and do my own analysis. Then I saw an article published in François by Marc Lazare, who is an observer of Italian politics. And he analyzed the political situation and said that Berlusconi had really shown the polls to be wrong. In the last,
Nelle ultime settimane ha fatto
a very intense, very media campaign, and I think, well, that's normal, isn't it? Why wouldn't he go to the media? He did. And in France, I would have thought it would be normal, but in Italy, a lot of people weren't able to go onto TV, and political transmissions were blocked. All the programs, Door to Door, which is an Italian one, all sorts of other ones, were just blocked. But via telephone calls and via presence, last week he managed to get onto pretty much all public and private TV of the time. So, I mean, it's an amazing situation. I think the voting was 23rd of March, but Monday beforehand, for more than 6 months alone, only he got time when all the housewives and all the people who were retired were actually going to be a captive audience and were subject to his bombarding. So the polls show that 13% of public opinion decided on who to vote for in the last week. So you'll understand the import of this, where nobody can go and give their political message over except somebody who happens to own the TV. That shows you the significance. And this is the sort of thing which people don't understand abroad. They don't understand the conflict of interest, such as it is when it comes to the information sector. In France, in Netherlands, in Germany, and in the United Kingdom, there's a press which is watching this. And French opinion, public opinion, when Sarkozy wanted to nominate his own son to La Défense, I mean, there was a complete uprising, and the press focused in on it, a scandal. And then he had to give in because of the press. And that shows that what I'm saying, good information is that which gives rise to good opinion formation and a good governing class, but it's got to be good quality information. So maybe we can hear now what is the role of the journalist, because information depends not only on sometimes somebody who owns the press, but sometimes the journalist who will determine the quality of information. So how do you get good information out? Thank you very much, Ms. Chair and the ALDE group. Thank you, Mr. Uggias, to allow me to speak about freedom of information, particularly in the Italian situation. I'm going against the tide, really. We just heard from Mr. Uggias. I say I'm going against the tide because personally I think that pluralism does exist. It does exist, in my opinion. Italy has the highest number of press agencies compared to other European cities. ANSA, ASCA, DN, Kronos, Agio, Picom, Velino, La Presse. In France, they have fewer. In Germany as well. United Kingdom, the same. Sometimes there's competition within the country, but there's not as much pluralism as there is in Italy. We have the highest number of generalist national newspapers, dailies. Very many of them. Before satellite and digital, the whole series of national TV channels compared to European countries. Some of them were public, others were private, a couple of private ones. And in the end there was a sort of monopoly or duopoly or even an oligopoly, maybe is the best way of saying it. But the real problem is elsewhere. Freedom of opinion or expression, I'm talking about that as against freedom of the press, I think is guaranteed in Italy. I've not seen any other country, journalists exchange polemics amongst themselves via newspapers or use public TV to really put clashing opinions and accuse each other of being wrong. I don't know whether you know the Italian situation. At the end of the last TV season, Santo Vespa, at the beginning of each, Santo and Vespa at the beginning of various analysis programs, were squaring off against each other quite often, using public TV almost as a private forum to fight each other. There's a problem of freedom of press. If you look at the press media in Italy, it is ill, it's in danger, and I explain why. Berlusconi for us is not the problem. He, rather, if it's a problem at all, he is a problem. He's not the cause of our ailment. He's a sort of epiphenomenon. He's the tip of the iceberg. There are other causes, much wider causes than just good old Silvio. And I think we journalists have got to start criticising ourselves, because we are fully part and parcel of the generation of the information system in Italy. The context, let's look at the written press, the main newspapers, national newspapers. Who owns the press? Fiat, actually, is the biggest industrial grouping in Italy. And who is the owner of Solo 24 Ore, Confindustria? It's finance, it's industry coming together. 24 Ore does cover economy and finance. Who owns the Repubblica? Mr. De Benedetti, who calls himself an entrepreneur, but also is a financier, as well as a newspaper editor. He's involved in the bankruptcy of Banco Ambrosiano. 40 billion lire of money was extracted from that a few decades ago. Who along with, there's Cassa di Risparmio di Trieste and Assicurazioni Generali. Those are important players in Italian economy. Assicurazioni Generali own shares in Corriere della Sera, and part of the people who get together and actually choose the editor. Mediobanca as well. It's one of the biggest business banks in Italy, along with Fiat, who owns La Stampa. And the Pesanti family, which makes cement, De Laval, who covers some of the press. Legresti covers insurance, people who own telecoms. And if you send a SMS in Italy, you pay a fee to him. People who own banks, Banco Popolare, for example. These are people who own real estate, big families who deal with cement, as I just mentioned. So there's a poor chap called Dieci Rotelli who owns 10% of Corriere della Sera. They won't allow this poor chap in. He deals with hospitals and deals with regional contracts there, but he's still a rich man. He still has influence. So all this is normal, and there's a similar trend in Italy, in France, I think, which is dangerous. The sort of agglomerations we have in Italy do run the risk of contagion in France. Berlusconi family obviously owns Il Giornale, and part of Il Foglio and Veronica and a whole series of things. You know about Berlusconi, but it's all part of one agglomeration of people. And then there's the radio TV. We have Mediaset, Berlusconi. Again, before becoming a media entrepreneur, he was involved in building. And we have La Setta, which is telecoms, Tronchetti Provera is that, and Rai. There's a strange situation there. It's not independent, it's not the BBC, it's not France Télévisions. It's in the hands of the parties. Parties choose who's going to manage it. Change of majority, It doesn't really matter. It's still the parties get together. All the parties get together and decide, with a few exceptions. Those who are not in the people who are on the RAI board and don't have enough votes, i.e. don't have enough interest in it, are just kept out. So it's still a party control. And we have a paradoxical situation, a called Murdoch paradox. Somebody who focuses on himself major he's saying, well, we've got to have freedom of expression in the world, and goes around saying that, but he's one who's the most monopoly owner. We have that in Italy as well. They proclaim freedom of press, but they are the monopolists. I don't know, last Monday you heard the debate between Fazio and Saviano, a lot of polemics. Director General of RAI wanted to, it would seem, put forward ideas from Silvio Berlusconi. That's what basically it was. And he did. A whole lot of people listened to this. RAI's doing a bit better now. It's got a lot more advertisements. And who won out of this? Obviously, Berlusconi. In a way, I envy France. Because there was a socialist president, Mitterrand, who came out with a rightist reform. He decided to privatize TF1 and also free up the TV system in general, with, I think, taking privileged advice from Berlusconi and Sarkozy as well. Has taken advertising away from public TV. Progress, people have said that they want that in Italy. BBC comes out with good TV independently of advertising. And we say that's a good thing in Italy, but unfortunately we don't. I envy France, they've got it there, we don't get that. We employ a lot of people, very often, in so-called public TV with advertising, and it's very bad quality. I won't compare it with data and BBC, I don't have time. But anyway, basically, what's the role of the journalist? Well, we have a problem. The problem with journalists is that we've seen who owns what. We've seen the policy of RAI. We see... only Murdoch is not in Italy, by the way, but he's pretty much everywhere else in the world. But we do have concentrations. And journalists should be defending freedom of the press instead of defending the interests of their clients and having a free press. They've chosen in Italy to follow the interests of vested interests. When I say vested interests, what do I mean? It can mean a lot of things. First of all, the interests of their masters, the editors, the owners. That is il potere, le pouvoir, the power, Fiat and the rest who own Corriere della Sera, Benedetti and the Repubblica. Where the power lies, very often journalists defend them. It's very difficult to find critical comments about their own editors or owners. Why? Because journalists, well, they respond basically not to the electorate, but to the editors, don't they? And then the interests of parties who run this, and the RAI told you parties are very strong here. So that's and press agencies as well. That's even more serious because it is the wellhead for journalists to get their basic information, raw material. Lista, which is financed by the government, although it is basically used by all Italian newspapers. Lista is very much in favour. This is the wellhead in favour of the government. Lorenzo Consoli will develop on that, but obviously people follow their own personal interests. They want to be head of a service, head of unit, career interests, editor, and that sort of thing. Well, they've got to keep their nose clean. Journalists try to satisfy there need to be political protagonists. Maybe they are people who are failed political protagonists, but they still want to act politically. What do? They don't tell the facts, which is what they should be doing, basically. Rather, in Italy, above all, what they do is they preach and promote their ideas, or basically those of le pouvoir, power, people who own the media. And this is very ugly. Very often, instead of informing their clients, their users, they shirk on the prime task of educating the masses. I mean, goes back in history, the idea of educating the masses. And we've seen this getting worse and worse. Very often there was a crisis in the past of people taking money, and now it's just towing the Berlusconi line. So it's been skewed over time, and this is what we've become we're not journalists, we're opinionists, if you will. We are preachers of the line. Santorio Vespa is a case which I mentioned beforehand with Rai becoming private property, although it's really a public entity, or should be. Instead of being a vector of information, they become information themselves. I mean, they do the information, they make the information. And this is a very dangerous thing, you know, they're not just relaying information objectively, they create it. And this is dangerous. We journalists in Italy, and not all of us in general, have abandoned the basic rules of journalism, which basically is the fundaments of credibility for media. And that's why people buy newspapers or watch TV in the first place, because they believe what's written or what they hear. 5 W's are where, what, when, and these sorts of things, which should appear in the first 5 lines of a newspaper. I've just bought Corriere della Sera Monday to look into the Fini political issue. I don't read the internal articles. I try and get the headlines. I don't get anything really. I mean, why? Well, the why, which is one of the big W's, is not there. There's no reason of why. Take Le Monde, which came out on Monday afternoon. Gianfranco Fini is asking for Berlusconi to leave. He's challenged him again, saying there's a split between the two. And they started off in 2009, People for Liberty, but in the 7th of November, Perugia, he called upon Berlusconi to bear in mind the problems, resign, and look at the review programme again. Otherwise, he will leave the government. So basically, that tells what's going on. And then he gives a whole page of why. There's a page explaining whom Fini is. People read that, they understand. But if I read my own newspaper, it's very difficult to understand that. And I should know about Italian politics. And the result. We try and justify all things we do, obviously. There's a new concept which they teach us in journalistic school, which is newsability. In order to be news, it's got to be newsable. And what does that mean? Anything or nothing. It's up to the journalist to decide what is newsworthy or not. Well, maybe the Prime Minister will burp, and that is considered to be maybe newsworthy or not. Depends on you. We see amazing things. Silvio Berlusconi came to Brussels. Is that really news? I don't know. He just went to Brussels. He left Rome. Is that news? No. He just left Rome. But nevertheless, you get that sort of thing, which is put out. So the result is we get a sort of journalism which is everything and nothing. Copy and paste, for example, very often. Because we don't inquire and analyse, we just copy things which have come out from elsewhere, say from a court or whatever. And journalists, instead of exchanging ideas, just become mudslingers. And it's like a big football game throughout the country. And for all European countries, particularly the new democracies of the East, where they're consolidating their democracy in some cases, though you can see similar degeneration to what we're doing. There's a danger in France looming, I think. Somebody more expert than myself will talk about this later on, where you've got the major economic players who buy newspapers, own them, and it's really up to the journalists to preserve the freedom of the press, but they're going to have the same pressures. Basically, being a journalist is a job like anything else. There are responsibilities, in this case to inform, tell people what's going on. It's not a mission, it's not a political career in any guise or an alternative political career. If you want to, it's a job. If you want to guarantee our jobs, you've got to respect the rules. If an architect designs a house, and if somebody builds a house without using the basic bricks, it'll fall down. And if a restaurant serves up stale fish, well, it won't last long, will it? Because clients will be fed up with being poisoned by the rubbish. And if a journalist does not respect the rules, which are basically independence, objectivity, precision in giving facts, accuracy in facts, being correct, and above all, sense of responsibility to the electorate and public opinion, and not the people who may be running wry at some time, the political groups, or somebody who owns the press. There's a conflict of interest. We talked about Fiat as well as Berlusconi, a whole series of people. Unless we keep to the basic rules, those fundamental rules, the electorate will turn its back on all this information industry as well. And the freedom of press in Italy, and I think in Europe, will be past history.
Grazie Davide, complimenti anche a te.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, David, and congratulations. I noted that a newspaper director said that information is good if it allows citizens or readers to form a balanced opinion without that being biased. And one shouldn't have to think about whether to exaggerate the information for any sort of partisan reasons. So I'm now happy to give the floor to Nathalie Griesbeck. Well, let me just give Giorgos Chatzimarkakis the floor because he has to go as well. Thank you.
Ma il mio italiano tecnico non è abbastanza bene, allora lo faccio in inglese, per favore.
I'm going to speak English, actually. I try to speak Italian.
In this parliament, the honor to welcome some members who are also here in the room, some journalists, to discuss again the question of freedom of expression, of media pluralism. We did that in the so-called media intergroup. We have intergroups that cover issues that are not covered by commissions in this House, and I have the honor to be vice president. And again, it's Italy that was one of the reasons why we discuss freedom of expression. I will tell you one example. Last week, we had in Germany, I have a Greek name, but I'm German MEP, but in Germany I represent the Greeks. So we had the summit of migration and integration. And we had an exchange of view with our Chancellor, Madame Merkel, and some of us were not very happy about the debate on migration in Germany, because there was a book in Germany, and there was a hot debate against some migrants, and then it was one by Turkish descent says, Mrs. Merkel, why didn't you intervene? Why didn't you tell the press not to be so hard on us? And she said, listen, I am the chancellor. I am the prime minister. If I do this, I influence the media. I can't do that. And I never would do that. You see the sensitivity. And this culture is not the same in every member state. There are different cultures. I know that at the moment there's a discussion again about Rai TV show. There's a discussion in France about investigating on journalists. And I can tell you, we are quite happy with a first step that was taken by the Commission, a three-step approach concerning media pluralism. That was initiated in 2007. How can we address media pluralism? Because it's not only antitrust, it's not only competition law, as we know. Now, the European Parliament in 2008 made a last big report on media pluralism. And then we had last year, 2009, initiated by Italia dei Valori, the Berlusconi debate. And we lost it by one vote. And we were quite unhappy about that. But what did the Commission do in the meanwhile? The Commission did a study on media pluralism. How can you assess it? What parameters do you need in order to show whether a country respects media pluralism? Is it geography? Is it religion? Is it freedom of expression? So, and this study is published on the website of the European Commission, and that's it. Because the Commission says, listen, the single market for ties, for shoes, is a different thing from different national markets on media. So you can't come up with one media law for the whole of Europe. What you can do, though, is you can put up some elements of media pluralism. This is on the website. And if a country risks not to respect media pluralism, freedom of expression, then you can make some remarks. This is not done yet. What we have is the tool, the instrument, but we don't have the courage of the Commission to say, listen, Italy, there's something wrong. And I think we need that. We need the courage by the Commission to ring a bell, to say the situation in some countries is not okay. We do that with the accession countries. A member state that wants to accede the European Union, Turkey, Iceland, Croatia, is checked. And we tell them, there's a wrongdoing, you have a monopoly, you don't have freedom of press. But the member states escape. And I think we have to change that. The Commission has to set standards, not to unify one European media market, that's not possible, but to set some basic standards that everybody has to accept. I would like to thank you very much for being here in the European Parliament. Grazie mille. Grazie mille, Giommaria.
Ringrazio Jorgo che parla benissimo.
Thank you, York. You speak Italian extremely well, but you launched yourself in English there. Wonderful, wonderful. You're a great linguist. I'll give the floor now to Natalie. Thank you for giving us your time. In France, too, we have the development of a very significant debate gelling out on information. So over to you.
I'm glad to be part of this for various reasons. One reason being that in this particular community institution, we do try to keep our own house in order, if I may say that. We do tend to make statements about countries around the world where certain rights are flouted. Sometimes we forget to be self-critical or to examine closely what's going on at home. And having listened to what's been said so far, I think that's been highlighted, and I've been listening to what you've been saying. We realize that the press or media in some countries which are regarded as, well, they are age-old civilizations, are under threat and even declining and being eroded. So I'm going to say a few things about France, but it does tally considerably with what has been said, but concentrating on France then for the moment, I can confirm that France is no exception when it comes to this problem of ensuring the freedom of the media. That was emphasized recently by Reporters Without Borders. This association produces a rating of press and media independence and freedom every year. The major European countries, which are deemed to be top in this rating, decline. Their rating goes down every year, and France is one of those, and our rating is now very poor, along with Italy. Before Rwanda, well, it's ahead of countries like North Korea, Rwanda, Yemen, and so on. But the fact is that we are getting worse and worse scores every year. Only 13 countries of the European Union are in the top 20, 14 the 20th place, with very low scores: Greece, Bulgaria, Romania, and Italy, which is 49th. I think France is 46. So we have to recognize that in this place we call Europe, there is no homogeneity when it comes to press freedom. Just let's take an example. The Scandinavian countries are clearly way ahead, but there are now major gaps between, there's a divide between the different European countries. And there are also in this rating the various dubious states of press freedom are highlighted. So France is not doing very well. There's been a problem of abuse of confidential sources. And as Mr. Carretta has pointed out, there's the attitude to the press by the powers, the political powers that be. There's a rather dismissive attitude and a lot of impatience. In France, it's becoming common for journalists to be investigated and tried in the courts, and this is threatening to something that we find very important in media freedom, and that freedom is a fundamental freedom. This seems to me, and I'm a lawyer by training and a member of the Civil Liberties Committee, so it seems to me that this is one of the fundamental elements of democracy. Mr. Carretta raised the problem of journalists, the problem of public opinion, and the way public opinion is educated. He used that word. I would perhaps soften that a bit and say it's a way of allowing public opinion to citizens, that is, to develop their own opinions based on the facts, rather than actually educating people. So that's what I believe, but I can be honest about this and say that each individual should be able to rebel, to take a different route and form a different opinion. And you illustrated eloquently this point. I should now be able to read many, many different sources on a story to form my own opinion, so that I can get to a genuine assessment of what happened. I now find that myself having to read papers like Le Canard Enchaîné. I never had time to do that, or never thought I should, but I find that they are better informed, and they manage to winkle out the important aspects of a story and highlight them, and they can then get discussion going. And that's sometimes enough to get them up before the courts. But what I find that is a fundamental point here is that press freedom, media freedom, is part of the separation of powers a la Montesquieu, but it's also a fundamental pillar of our society. It's a way of ensuring that you have the checks and balances you need, the separation of power between the judiciary and the government. And those political powers and media freedoms and citizens' ability to form an opinion are closely linked. And those citizens then, let's remember, can then vote in accordance with their views. So all these events happen very quickly, and these things evolve quickly, as we've seen. So countries that have always been considered highly democratic, that can change. So then in France, since the 1789 Declaration of Freedoms and Rights, there are certain freedoms that are considered vital, that form part of the constitution by the French judiciary, such as press freedom. They really make up democracy. And there's a whole legal framework and arsenal behind that is very well established. It relies on the legislator, and it relies on the constitutional courts to interpret and enforce it. If that system is then strengthened, you find that reality goes beyond fiction even. These laws and constitutions exist, but there are cases coming before the European Court of Human Rights, which can ensure freedoms and can interpret them, particularly regarding press freedom and the freedom of journalists to exercise their profession. But along with those guarantees, we have the legal system, we have protection, we have the European Court of Human Rights. Now, I'm not going to go through all the case law, but there is a great deal of case law from that court about violations of press freedoms by French media. The court has ruled against France under Article 10. Oh, that's the violation of freedom of information at the Court of Human Rights. So the legal pronouncements have been made, and this deterioration of press freedom nonetheless continues. So it is constantly being repeated. France has been considered exemplary in press freedom, but that then is changing, and along with that goes a deterioration of the role of journalists. And Mr. Carretta talked about President Mitterrand, a left-wing president who had a right-wing policy, or seemingly a conservative right-wing policy on press freedom. The current French head of state, who comes from the conservative stable and appears to be advocating a more left-wing policy. Well, this isn't just going to be decided over these 5 years that Sarkozy will be president. It was already being developed under President Mitterrand. But it's very striking to note that and to see that since 2007, the restrictions of President Berlusconi, since then we've seen some quite surprising developments in France. Truth is stranger than fiction. I think since 2007 then, in France, we've seen a total reorganization, a total overhaul of the French media. We've seen people being thrown out, new appointments being made, a lot of clashes between the authorities and the media, investigations, attempts to violate confidential sources, the principle of confidential sources, and a lot of resistance to the press, particularly in the last few weeks. That raises the issue of independence. I hardly need to speak to this really, because Mr. Carretta has illustrated it so well. But perhaps I'll add just the French dimension. How have we organized independence there? Well, the media system, media in France, in the broadest sense, is organized by a network of friends of the public authorities. So there's a problem of financial oversight, but also the appointment of the managers and leading figures. What I'd like to say, really, is that the French system is controlled from inside. If I talk about a network of friends, well, without prejudice to the role of the president in the loss of independence in the French media, this network of friends is a very powerful one, which is now at the head of all the major media organizations, and that is open to question. Martin Bouygues, for instance, who is the closest friend and is at the head of TF1, the main French channel. Arnaud Lagardère heads the group that governs Europe 1, Paris Match, the Journal du Dimanche, and so on. Also close to the president, Serge Dassault, the owner of Le Figaro, Bernard Arnault from Les Echos. That's a good newspaper, actually. François Pinault from Le Point. So newspapers and media, well, obviously a very sort of hot group, leading group, hardcore group around the president. So there's a great deal of complicity there. They are bedfellows indeed, and that raises questions about the independence of the media. Independence vis-à-vis the executive. Obviously, it's not just the executive that makes up political power, but that forms part of it. And that's, I would say, a sine qua non for democracy. So in order to that is an important aspect of democracy. As regards financial oversight or auditing, the current situation there is a constant control or monitoring of the public authorities. So they own half the capital of the France Presse agency, which, unlike the Italian example, is almost the only provider of information. It is the source for most French journalists. That is owned by the French executive. There's also the issue of social costs and VAT. I don't know whether that's been mentioned up to now, but there has been the issue of taxation of the media, which affects their independence. Then there's direct subsidies. So they've had tax reductions. And the media organizations and newspapers do have subsidies. Then there's radio and TV channels. And it's interesting to look at this. With big stories, with this the European perspective we have, for example, if you look at the TV news, for instance, it's very interesting to see how, in my country, what sort of line is taken, what sort of angle is given two stories on the independence of journalists. As regards control over the staff, certain photos were taken of Cecilia Sarkozy, that was Mr. Sarkozy's second wife, which were published on the front cover of Paris Match. The director of Paris Match was sacked in 2006, and in 2009, when the reform took place, that is, the Media Council was reformed. There was the question of reforming advertising and other major issues. But behind all those key issues, the reform, one of the effects of the reform was that RFI, France 24 and TV5 were set up by a presidential decree and can only be revoked by presidential decree with CSA approval. So then, halfway through 2010, things hotted up in France on this subject. Things were changing apace every day, and there were so many infringements of press freedom. In 2010, then, there were further leading French journalists who were very popular were also sacked. Gérard Daran was sacked after a very tough story on Michel Alliot-Marie, a French minister. So there was really a whole flurry of incidents between the government and the French media. Also in 2010, there was a lot of investigations launched against journalists, attempts to breach confidential sources, which comes back to an act of January 2010, issued or adopted by those who govern us in France, and which was being violated very openly for a number of weeks by them. In the context of the Vote Betancourt case, a family case, and there was a suspicion that illegal funding of a major political party was being concealed. And there was a series then of clashes and difficulties between the media and political power. So then the authorities took on a very threatening tone vis-à-vis journalists, insulting them, using certain terms. And France then became almost the worst offender in terms of pursuing journalists, where journalists were taken into custody in the French way. Their press cards were withdrawn and accusations were made against them. So you'd think really you were in the movies, because things were happening so quickly. The Canard Enchaîné newspaper offices were searched. Then there was the Clearstream case, where Mr. de Villepin was set against, was in the eye of the storm. In 2008, Vittorio De Filippis, former director of Libération, was arrested in his own home for public defamation, and that was very awkward. In 2008 also, Dasquier was also taken into custody, and he was asked to reveal his sources. In February 2008, the Nouvel Observateur was attacked by was subject to criminal charges by the presidency, and that's the first time in France the head of state was charging a newspaper for using photographs of himself and his wife, and took civil action against the newspaper. So there are issues of immunity there for the president, and becoming a civil party in an action was done because a private individual apparently got access to his bank details or something like that. It's not very clear what happened. So there's a legal and constitutional problem there of immunity of the head of the executive. So there's a lack of equality between the two parties. So there were many, many legal problems there. In July 2008, journalists were accused of showing a film of the president in which he got angry with a technician in a France 3 interview. And there were also a number of legal proceedings and charges against Mediapart for using allegedly insulting clips of ministers, and also in the context of the Vote Betancourt case, a Le Monde journalist and someone else from Le Point, I think, were suspected of having telephone contact with a judge with whom they had written a book. Le Monde accused l'Élysée for having used a body which, the DRCI, which is similar to the Secret Service, which apparently had instructions to go into the Le Monde premises to look at what was being done on this Vote Betancourt case. So this is an area where developments are happening very fast. And it seems that the authorities are very worried indeed, and this is causing them to make all kinds of legal mistakes. Also, in terms of civil liberties, if you have an inquiry which is going on within another, well, it's an attempt to unravel what is happening on the whole issue of breaching confidential sources, which is one of the fundamental press freedoms. A few days ago, in this case of the breach of confidential sources by Le Monde, journalists' individual phone bills and phone records have been used to produce criminal charges, whereas the prosecution service in France requires journalists' permission to reveal these phone records. That's what usually happens. So all these abuses of the law on the protection of sources, you have the various abuses of journalists' practice, and in addition, and this is not the cherry on the cake, as it were, it's just the latest episode since Vote Betancourt. There have been a number of burglaries on the same day. Computers have been taken where journalists had stored their information. And we were told that this was a coincidence that the journalists were burgled on those days. But it does seem surprising that on the very same day, two journalists who were investigating the same story had had their computers stolen from their homes. So there, in short, and I think probably rather passionately, because I do think we mustn't get complacent about this. We must be able to get angry about it. And I know I need to be quick because I have the feeling that I've been speaking at length, and there is so much to say on this. Now, lastly, I would say that from a European perspective, we can't target one country or another. We wouldn't achieve our aims by doing so. But I could imagine that perhaps if we had a directive on freedom and pluralism and the problems of threats as a way of restricting that pluralism, and that is a threat to European democracy, and possibly on how to create the conditions for democracy, perhaps we could have more transparency in the appointment of leading figures and to ensure transparency and the necessary guarantees. So, in a nutshell, there's a great deal of work to be done, a great deal of progress to be made. We are not resting on our laurels. And perhaps, unlike my colleague on my left, I have a great deal of faith in European citizens. I think that they can do a lot through remaining loyal at the polls and through their actions on the internet and all these networks that exist, that they can express their views and also be the guarantors of democracy.
Grazie, grazie Natalie. Prima di...
Thank you, Natalie. Before giving the floor to Lorenzo Consoli, thank you. France does look as it much better than Italy. Your sketch there is cause for concern. As we've just heard, there seems to be an infection going throughout Europe. You referred to division of powers, Montesquieu. If there's another power, including the fourth estate, it still has to have the same sort of discipline as others. And this is perhaps a challenge. And it's on the European Parliament to do something about. Thank you very much indeed. So, Gianni Vatamo has come. You're being very quiet and listening. Please take a seat later on to make your statement. Anyway, Lorenzo.
Un giornalista d'agenzia qui a Bruxelles da molto.
Oh, I'm a journalist in Brussels. I've been here for some time. I've been a member of the International Press Corps in Belgium for some time. My license to report here will finish at the end of this month, but anyway, we're having a general discussion on freedom of information, pluralism in Italy and Europe in general, and I think I can give you my ideas. In 2007 I wrote an article in a magazine published then by an MEP, Mr. Chiesa, and I'm saying things which I've already written actually back then, plus a few new things, because some new things have happened. In particular, internet. Things have been added to the written press, something which has come off the printing press, which wasn't so evident then. I will just start off by saying that the problem of freedom of the press, the way it's dealt with, very often forgets about press agencies. They are behind and provide a lot of the information. Which is given by then newspapers, radio, TV. They're the primary source. News is basically provided by the press agencies to the other media bodies, who then decide what to do. More depth, analyze, comment. But the press agency, mostly, is the source of news or information which then becomes news elsewhere. However, when you look at the analyses which are carried out on pluralism, media concentration, and the way in which information works and its mechanism, people don't mention press agencies. It's very strange. Even in the Council of Europe, people tend to forget about this, I've seen. Because they pretty much control a lot of the information. So something which is not rational here, a bit odd. And if you also bear in mind that in Italy in particular, the press agencies have particularities which don't exist in other countries. Well, there perhaps two. There are so many of them. In Italy, I'll mention the ones I know. We have.
Quella principale.
Main one, answer.
L'Appicom, che è la mia, l'ADN Kronos, l'Asca, la Dire, il Velino, Radiocor, cioè la Reuters italiana, c'è una nuova agenzia che si chiama Nova.
Nova, a whole series of others, and smaller ones too. That doesn't exist in any other part of the world. No other part of the world can you actually support so many agencies. Most of them, please note, give the same news out. Start with those are not specialized on particular niches. Radio Core obviously is an economic thing, on economics and finance. The others basically just repeat the same news with the same often headings, with not much difference between them. So what are they doing? Well, I've understood what they're doing. I've understood why there's so many. And you can understand how they maintain themselves. But all these agencies are maintained with finance from government. I'll give you figures if you like, going back to 2007, but the most recent I could get, because it's difficult to get this sort of figure. They're supported by government, basically, and secondly, the raison d'etre of this huge number of press agencies is due to the fact that they just repeat over and over again the same message, which very often is a political message, which, if you like, can then be considered to be news. What is news? A sort of a newsworthiness depends not on the intrinsic value of the information, but the fact that so many press agencies are repeating the same thing in the same area. So something which might well not be news. I said this in 2007, it's quite right now still. They're very often in press agencies. They have little stars on news to show that it's urgent. But why is it urgent? The fact that somebody got off his plane, he came from Rome to here, or there's even good weather, a nice day. I mean, it's nonsense. Non-events are starred and underscored in this sense. Somebody came to the European Council, well, so what? Oh, well, maybe it might have been more interesting to know that he arrived late. But that would have been at least bad news. The fact that he comes is not news per se, intrinsically. So what is the problem? The way in which head editors, heads of service, and people who manage newspapers decide on relevance of information is a very specific thing. They have on their screens all the agencies, and as soon as more news comes in, I mean, a bit of news underneath goes down the screen. And when there's a whole lot of information on the same thing, the whole screen is occupied by the same bit of news, and people say, oh, this must be news. And they jump up and say, well, this is news. Whereas being a good journalist is different. It should be a bit more analytic, make sure it's more important than the rest, and it's a bit unusual or whatever. But the fact that the screen is filled with a quantity of these flashes saying the same thing does not mean that it's news. And people don't have the time, editors don't have time really often to go into greater depth on what is true and what is genuine news. Basically, the flash, the star, and the whole screen being filled with it means, okay, they say, ah, news. And Berlusconi's people understood this absolutely perfectly, and it's true. It very often happens that if a press agency does star whilst the politician is speaking, a star for something which is totally insignificant, an anodyne statement from the favoured politician, he gets a telephone call. Well, you're not following. This is starred, you know. And we finance you, they say. Are you getting government money for the agencies? Your contract spent on us, you're not following. Why are the stars? And, you know, and the editors, heads of service and the rest of us feel obliged in the agencies to follow step by step what this geezer is saying, even when it's not important, when they're saying absolutely nothing, when it's blather. They feel they have to follow it. So what is the upshot of this, basically? Well, basically, there's no time to go into depth on what the person is saying. If I go to a congress, I listen to somebody who's speaking, and if I have to keep on telephoning to say whatever it is he said, I'm not really listening to the thread of the argument. I'm just spewing back what he said. I can't criticize it. I'm not really analyzing what it says. As a journalist, if I have to keep on, I become a sort of megaphone of what the geezer has said, of what the man has said. It doesn't need to be a politician. It could be somebody who runs a bank or somebody who's a heavyweight, or, you know. But the point is, you lose your critical faculties. I'm not critically reporting what somebody said. I'm not even putting in contrary arguments. I'm not even challenging what he's arguing. This is the problem. I can't even put questions. In Italy, press conferences, you may have noted this yourself, in that wonderful program, Gozanti's one, Viva Zapatero, it was in TV. The German correspondent in Italy said, you never come up with a supplementary. The first question goes out. Okay, fine, you get a response. And, you know, it's the usual prepared thing. But you should have your second one up your sleeve to unmask the first response. Find the weak point where you're going to put him in difficulties. If you don't come up with a supplementary, you're not being a genuine journalist. In Italy, nobody does a supplementary. Here in Brussels, perhaps we do. Although very often people, ministers, heads of council don't really want to do press conferences. But in Italy, nobody comes up with a second question. In Italy, freedom of press exists. We have 3, Sky, Sette, Rai 3, who are free channels, critical, wonderful reporting programs, actually. It's my opinion. Gabanelli works and comes up with a European standard program, but, you know, that's it. They don't get that much money compared with the rest. They have to compete with other programs very often. But they still exist. Definitely there. Newspapers, they're free. They criticize the government. We talked about Repubblica. We've got a new newspaper, daily, completely independent. It's just come out in Italy, and it's being a great success. Lots of newspapers still do their job, but the real problem in freedom of press, as we know, is the majority of TV channels. But the problems, as I say, goes back to agencies. Agencies are at the base of the whole information system. There's a problem in Italy, which I've explained. And there's another thing. 90–95% of cases of agencies, they give not news, but statements, affirmations. And easy to see this. Look what Reuters writes, AFP, DPA, the Spanish one. All those agencies. I mean, look at how they work. But there's not existed all these articles which start off with a topic. That's at the top, colon, and then you get an affirmation. 95%. Well, plucking up that figure, but what I mean is majority. I don't know if it's 95%, but articles of press agencies are set up that way. You just get an affirmation. That's not what happens elsewhere. You just get a statement from the geezer or the man who's speaking, and it's given out as news, as I said beforehand, and it's supposed to be authoritative, as though he's saying something very significant. It might be absolute rubbish. It's not really newsworthy, and it should be newsworthy. No news agency, which is not Italian, will just say topic, colon, name of somebody you've never heard of, and just an affirmation. We've seen all sorts of second and third rank politicians, and they're quoted word for word by the agencies, because in a way they're sort of spokespeople, the mouthpieces for something or other. And this is our vice in Italy. Everybody sounds off on everything. Anybody will thump a tub. And agencies just report it. So, or just relay it. The hierarchy of the agencies, as I've told you what happens, what they want, is quantity, not quality, for reasons I've explained. And journalists reckon to be good, not if it comes up with a good analysis article, but if it comes up with all sorts of articles, swiftly scribbled off, gets it out before the others. We're all equal, of course, but if you're first amongst the equals, you get the limelight. So, and that's what, and that depends on your being considered to be a good journalist. It's quantity. Copy and paste, very often. Copy and paste. They see something, geezer said something, the man has said something, copy paste, bung it in, and some are a bit more conscientious than that. Sometimes they try and look at some sort of significance, but I mean, when it's quite blatantly not of any interest at all, they add a few words of spoof analysis, and it stays on the network. And basically, it's all useless. It's rubbish. And that encourages, for example, Marco Sumi, as you know him very well. And members just send all this sort of stuff to him, and this is stuff which is of no interest to us. But if you know it's going to be put out, you do it. Dozens of things, that sort of uselessness goes out from Brussels or wherever it is every day for that purpose. And they're put on via agencies. They're given the dignity of articles, and they're not. It's just a quantity of things. And this happens in Italian agencies, not in other agencies, but in Italian agencies. Figures for 2007. I don't know, I think it's pretty much the same for the years afterwards as well, but Alpha, 32.1 million euro, Agi, 12 million, Dino Kronos, ask him to slow down if you want any of these figures.
Scusate una cosa, prodomo mia, siccome l'APCOM è l'ultima arrivata, è quella che ha avuto meno in assoluto. Il criterio.
The criterion for giving this money is not something which makes any reference to quality or quantity of the news or people employed. It's arbitrary, very based on historical reasons. People come up late, get a few crumbs. If you look at the number of staff per agency, you will see, for example, journalists Egypt are financed 112,000 euro per year for each of them. That's quite a lot. That's heavy. That's the average. Some more, some less, but they're paid. Vienna-Kronos, 118,000 euro. Lasker, 105,000 each. Apicom, 29. The poor chaps. So maybe they have to come over here to earn a crust in Brussels. But anyway, that's a peculiarity of Italy. We know press agencies, for example AFP, have strong public support. They do, because national press agencies are very often used for foreign news, very much used by embassies. So they do get strong government support going to that particular press agency for the value they have in getting out foreign information for government and that sort of thing. But here, it's a lot more than that. It's generalized and much more. And it goes beyond the sort of usefulness which, or the use which an agency might have for a government. Another significant thing. Given the situation where we have degradation of what's going on by way of journalistic work, their jobs are becoming more and more precarious. That's normal. If a journalist or an agency, and this has enough, you can see this in other media as well, only sort of copies and pastes what he's seen on his screen of a press statement which has just popped up. They're all sitting in front of a computer every day just to copy and paste stuff which has been sourced elsewhere. The internet, for example, or have to go and wait for hours, say in the Parliament, and then grab something which doesn't mean anything, and they're supposed to just copy and paste that. What's the point of having professional journalists? You have to think about that. What you need are people who carry out what journalists are supposed to do: critical work, research, proper reports, inquiries. But at the moment, it doesn't seem as though you need those. You just need some sort of young somebody who wants to make a mark. He just sees an article somewhere published and he's content and that, maybe even happy to get little work and maybe happy for a precarious contract. Temporary contracts are renewed and then suddenly they can be kicked out if people don't want them. If they're satisfied with that, okay. That sort of profession is precarious and it's actually growing. And it's a very great danger for freedom of the press, this lack of stability. People of quality need some sort of stability. They need a bit more than instability in order to do what journalists should be doing. And I would say even for people who are not necessarily doing exactly what journalists should be doing, something midway, even for them it's dangerous. But it's something which is spreading throughout Europe. There's more and more internet and internet news services. There's a new geography, a new scenery involved now in news. There are other possibilities. News is on internet. And it doesn't have to be produced in that way by journalists. The market for news, I've been told by my administrators, the authorities back in Italy, the market as it was doesn't exist any longer. What's happening is not real manufacturing of news or coming up with news, it's repackaging stuff which you sourced elsewhere with the odd photo tacked on. That's what's going on. An honest agency journalist is not going out to find news, find information, and perhaps be paid a bit more for that. Nobody's paying for that any longer because there's no market for that. The market at the moment is multimedia, wants bits of film, photos, brief, fast food snippets with illustrations. That's what they want. So press agencies are being changed. As my agency was saying, unfortunately, at the moment, is becoming multimedia information purveyors of stuff. Real news, what agencies were doing so far, doesn't exist any longer, and it's not really reckoned to be worthwhile. That's put aside, and what's done is packaging, post-production packaging, multimedia stuff. That means that you already have your information. All you have to do, get it from somewhere and package it, and you're not involved in that in creation any longer. You're not convincing. What you're doing is titivating it, attaching a picture. But you're not producing the news any longer. You're not doing the legwork. The legwork, as the old journalists used to do. You're just sitting and repackaging in front of a computer. The other thing, which I think is worth stating here, a natural upshot of the crisis, and not just Italy, I think I've gone beyond that now, we're at European level, what I'm saying now. There's no business model for agencies any longer. Today, when I write news for an agency, which I think has value, and would mean that my agency would get a purchase, people would sign up to it, in newspapers, banks, and the rest will say, okay, that's good, I'll sign up for that. When I write news, what I think is news, 10 minutes later, 5 minutes later, sometimes only 3 minutes later, I find it. Not as a news from my agency or my name on it, but somebody else has copied and pasted and tacked his name on. Throughout all the newspapers, I find my word for word copied and pasted by somebody who sticks his name on top, as if it was a Repubblica or Corriere della Sera or whatever it is, article of their own, or even online sites do the same. I've lost my value because it just people sort of managed to pick it up somehow or other and without paying anything, and so the business model doesn't work. It's not as though I'm doing something which will make people sign up to my agency, because it's just grabbed by other people. And these ones who are financed by the state, I mean, there's no market for what they're doing. You can't live in a market of this type. They're going to disappear as genuine agencies. And in the old days, people signed up for some time when there was no online sites, and people renew their subscriptions. If my articles are not to be published the next day, but are just grabbed online somehow or other, well, I should be paid a lot more, because I'm basically committing business suicide if people can just grab it for free and then put it out as their own. And this is not a business model which will work for a long time. It's not as it was in the past with newspapers buying, signing up and publishing it the next day. They just grab it immediately. There's a lot of online media who can do the same thing, sectorial stuff. My articles I found spread out the media universe, and online sites who don't actually pay to sign up. I don't know how they get it, but it appears. So there's not a genuine news market, inter alia, because nothing is being done to protect the market from abuse. So I think I've spoken for a bit more than a quarter of an hour, perhaps. Maybe I could possibly finish off, but just one last thing. Look, be careful. You have to be very careful. The idea of news on the internet, and therefore you can do without agencies. Well, that's an idea, but very often what's on the internet, you cannot put your trust in it, or the same sort of trust you would put in a press agency, because agencies and journalists have to verify, or supposed to verify, what they put in there. But stuff you take off the internet from anywhere, you Google in something and then a keyword and then you find news. Very often that news, well, you don't know where it's come from. Just one example. Very famous blog online site in Italy, one of the most famous ones. I like it. Pepe Grillo, it's called. On Pepe Grillo's blog, a little while ago, I found a piece of news which was put out as certain sure that the Commission had already condemned Italy with daily fines which were accruing because of the case of Europa Seta, that channel. I don't know if you're aware of it, but anyway, the question of frequencies and all sorts of other problems there. But it wasn't true. That was just not true. Somebody had really dragged in by the sort of hair end, dragged it in by its pigtails, and said, well, this is certain sure news, genuine news, but it wasn't. And it stayed there for about a week. I wrote in to say it wasn't true, but it was still there. I don't know if it still is there, but if there are no agencies, and if the news is just taken from internet, well, you can't believe it, necessarily. There's another problem of freedom of press and democracy, because then, when somebody knows how to manipulate information on TV and on internet, then we're finished. We're done.
Grazie a te Lorenzo, un interessantissimo spaccato.
Thank you. Thank you. Very interesting insider's view on how, on the genesis of information. You really have a good base to say this. On the left, we have somebody who's unique. David Sassoli is an MEP and head of delegation for the Democratic part of the Socialists and Democrats in the European Parliament. As you know, he has figured strongly on Italian news media and TV, so we're very interested to hear what you have to say.
Vi ringrazio, ho sentito...
Well, thank you. I've been listening to what's been said, and I think I would need to think carefully about all these points that have been made. We're talking about press freedoms and some of the restrictions. And if we talk about the profession of journalists, I think these are things we need to think about in a certain way. Especially in Italy. Well, the situation is much more serious than it is in France. We seem to have an incurable disease in Italy. And it's true that in Europe the phenomenon seems to be spreading. Now, when we had the first major parliamentary battle about this, I found myself debating freedom and information. Well, we lost that fight by 2 or 3 votes here in the Parliament. And since then, the situation has become even worse. If we look at recent events, we see that journalists have been arrested in Greece. In Estonia, the Parliament is supposed to adopt new legislation on the protection of journalists' confidential sources, but that is a law that's going to be actually eroding journalists' rights there. There's also been cases against Spanish journalists, and you talked about the famous cases in France. So there have been a number of events, and Mr. Sarkozy is able to appoint the head of public television channels. In Hungary, the situation is very difficult there because there is a reform underway, and the government could end up having tougher controls over the media as a result. So in Italy then, the whole disease is spreading, as I said. So what can we do? What can we do to protect this public asset? It's a public asset that, similar to all those assets that we think are indispensable. It's essential for our society. And in the political history of Europe, if you look at that, there have been various attempts to sweep this issue under the carpet. The European Commission has said that it doesn't want to get involved. And in the Parliament, we had this battle, as I said, and we asked the Commission to get involved and to give us the tools, to give countries tools to regulate this very particular and sensitive area. For example, some rules or standards on public television. The Italian situation is so abnormal that we have to look at all possible conflicts of interest. For example, the biggest conflict of interest in the history of Western civilization is probably Silvio Berlusconi. And if you look at the media landscape in Italy, you will see that there are many other conflicts of interest. The big Italian newspapers are not independent. They're not independent. They have to take cognizance of certain interests. Their owners are leading figures from industry, from banking, insurance, and so on. So, in Italy, the media sector is overshadowed or is sort of weighed down by a whole layer of conflict of interest, which has an impact on everyone. Even journalists we take a positive view of. In politics, sometimes information is propaganda, that's true. But entrepreneurs, bankers, those in insurance, don't do any different. So there's a confusion between information and propaganda, and we should be alive to that. We should be alert to this, because we believe that information is a vital public asset and the freedom of that information, and we should protect it from all these interests. These vested interests. There's also politics, not just politics. So, what should we do? In the European Parliament, we did put a question to the Commission. We said, give us some standards for public television broadcasts, for instance. And then we would have to look at the link between power and information. That relationship is managed differently in different countries. In France, there's a certain system. In Italy, we have another system, which is very peculiar. It's abnormal, even if you compare it to other countries. Our public television or state television is controlled by the government and the parliament. Well, the parliament, yes, but the government, no. So the State Television Board is appointed by a government in Italy. To find a similar example, you'd have to go back to Ceausescu's day. It's a case where the government is deciding this, is actively involved. And I think when it comes to public services, we should have European rules and standards so that Italy could correct the steer. And I think, as was said, we've lost the fight. We lost that particular battle, but we must continue to fight to get these European standards and rules for public services, for radio and television. What should this be like? Well, to separate politics and information. And what sort of authority should one have to act as guardian of that public asset? what guarantees should be provided, what checks and balances should there be, so that these channels can grow. In Italy, although not exclusively in Italy, it's often said that state television shouldn't be able to get advertising revenue, but there are examples of there are indeed examples of state TV or state channels that don't have advertising revenue. But to achieve that in Italy, you'd need a pretty solid agreement between state television and the people, because state television is very expensive, and most TV revenue comes from advertising or some sort of subscription or tax. There's no other source of revenue. How else are you going to fund it? Either advertising or taxation or fees. And in some countries you have those two sources of funding, but in Italy that is not the case. If we're going to take the route, go down the route of fees or taxes, you have to have something in a state television that can make its mark, something that otherwise it's dependent on taxpayers' money. Then there's funding and investment, and that funding should allow a state television to grow. We don't need to think, as ultra-liberals do, that state TV in this way would have to fail, would have to crumble. No, you can do it differently, but you have to be proactive. You need certain types of funding for television. Well, that could be provided if we didn't have this huge conflict of interest that I was talking about. In other words, the link between the political world and information. You could have state channels or public channels which could represent different political opinions. So those channels would have to be pluralist. Radio and television channels would have to be very much more pluralist if they were public. So in politics, some of us at least think that there should be certain foundations, that we should have certain basic rules to ensure that independent information is guaranteed. When the centre-left wins the elections, during the first few days, they'll have to table some legislation that will be very short, and it will say that companies benefiting from advertising revenue are not allowed to own television channels. But those who have advertising, well, they happen to be those who own the channels. So there are interests there that are interlinked, and that's something that should be reorganized according to a system of liberal democracy. Those who benefit from advertising revenue should not be able to own public television channels. Or television channels. That would be the size of it. That would be all the legislation would need to say. And that would mean that the Italian system would take account of independence And media companies would then not be saddled with this conflict of interest. And media players, those in communication, would be able to be responsible and aware of their priorities. Article 21 of the Italian Constitution is constantly quoted, and it comes from the universal principle of the freedom of information. So we are thinking of a reform of the Constitution. That Constitution was written 60 years ago, a time when people were not worrying about this spider's web of information that we now have. This very much enriched world of communication that we now have, nobody knew that was going to happen. In our constitution then, we have fundamental principles, and we have social rights. That's the great point about the 21st century. You have the liberty, the freedom to exercise the medical profession, but also the right to health. So we have all these additional rights now. You have the right to practice certain professions and the right to work. The European legal tradition has linked individual freedoms with social rights. But I think that is not enough today. We can't just refer to freedom of expression. We have to translate it into a social right. So the freedom to express one's opinion is sacrosanct. That is an essential plank of European culture and Western culture. But the right to information, to good information, must be the translation of this important individual freedom, its translation into law, into social law. That is a feeling that is increasingly shared. So if we are aware in society and we can't enjoy that important public benefit, then we risk remaining on the sidelines and just being in the second division, as it were, not really being at the center of things. Individual freedom is a great freedom, and we have a political responsibility. We need to be able to translate this freedom into social laws and social rights, which are often flouted, as we've heard. We've heard about we've heard journalists speak before me, and they have illustrated eloquently this whole problem. Today we have the huge weight of these vested interests, which are now crushing these freedoms and indeed the profession of journalism. Journalists should be independent and accountable. A lot has been said about the information market. The media shouldn't invent news. The information market offers all kinds of topics to journalists, topics that they could present. If that were all reported and presented, then it would be a very cloudy picture. Thank you.
Grazie, grazie David.
Thank you, David. I know you have to go. So I'd like to say thank you to you. Sorry, I have a delegation meeting, so I have to get to that, and I have to chair it. Oh, he's head of the Italian delegation. Okay, well, thank you for coming anyway. Thank you, Natalie. You've been with us all evening. I'd like to thank you. Well, I just wanted to say this. Everything which has been said this evening will be distilled, put into a document, which we will disseminate. As Lorenzo was saying, it won't be a tome. It will be, if you like, something which gives the essence of what you said. And the basic factors which will make it a document, I think, of great interest. Luca Vullo, who is a Sicilian editor, has done very good work. So far will deal with the collation and give the basic significance of what's been said, so it goes beyond the walls of this room and accrues the relevance which it merits. So, let me say immediately, I was going to give you a report, and that was in one briefcase, and in another I had my notes for this evening. To pick up the wrong thing, and I left my report elsewhere. I'm sorry. I don't want to really repeat and say, maybe I'll add bits from time to time in the process. I'll try and be brief, but synthetically, maybe I cross-cut what's been said so far. I wanted to be not too Italian, given what's been said already. We've heard from French and Dutch as well, remember? And German. Says the speaker, we've heard from Germans. So, we're looking to freedom of press. David and Lorenzo mentioned that too. But behind this I have a concern. I didn't want it to become too Italian, as I said, but having heard what's been said, it seems to me that this, if you like, bit of oil on the water, which is spreading out from Italy, didn't just stop in France or Germany, but it went further. Obviously, maybe the origins were in Italy, at least from our point of view. But we did look at it more widely because the phenomenon has spread. I think the European vantage point is a privileged forum, and we picked up what David said about news and Fini in the Italian press and Nicola Rinaldi, our head of delegation. Welcome. You can come and sit by me if you like. For a second, we're just tying up the loose ends, Nicola. But we also heard how the French information media works. But so we've seen all sorts of differences. News making or news dissemination is very diverse, and there are different ways in which it impacts upon public opinion. Another thing, in November 2009. The head of the Italian government did something which pretty much was not noticed in Italian. He went to the last dictator on the European continent, Lukashenko. He's head of Belarus, and he has spoof elections, controls the country, has secret services. He fills the prisons, he runs, and all the rest of it. He always wins the elections. Whether or not we have a Berlin Wall, we still have Lukashenko. Every few months, the European Parliament adopts a stance about something which has happened in Belarus. Say, well, let's close trade with them, let's not have economic and social relations with them, we say, until democracy reigns again in Belarus. Berlusconi in November 2009 went to Belarus. To the amazement of everybody here, at least made statements saying, okay, people love you, don't they? And we see how in what good esteem you're held. Scandal here. Journalists up in arms, pond up in arms, and the news went everywhere, in Italy too. I'm talking about now TV. It wasn't given in the overall context of what was behind it. But I'm talking about TG1, one of the more government-friendly channels, just said, well, Berlusconi went there to Belarus, and that was it. As if they were saying, well, he went to France or Germany or UK in the same way. And they didn't give any of the problems or the blemishes. That shows how news can be manipulated, and how, above all, it can be manipulated for public opinion, in order to manipulate public opinion. No idea of doing it correctly or properly. It's just to manipulate opinion. That's the sole reason. And today, having heard what's been said, I've become more aware of how important it is to get to the root of things. One of the situations which has become clear in the debate we've had in the Parliament on freedom of information in Italy is that the Italian model, that is media control, above all of TV, is becoming something else. It's morphing. And it's happening in other places as well, Bulgaria and Romania, Hungary. So people are taking shortcuts when it comes to news, and use public TV, and in that way try and manipulate to a consensus which supports them. Getting back to Consoli, about the agencies. Look at what the agencies are doing. That's very important. And see how news is actually garnered from them. Above all, this is important when it comes to the printed media. But at the final part of what he said that today our news works if it's multimedia. That is to say, if it gets onto TV, on internet as well. And the idea of the printed page is no longer so important. Perhaps people don't read politics any longer or go beyond headlines, but if they do, what they want is a picture, more or less. So I base myself on the idea of Karl Popper, a great modern philosopher, a great student of TV as a phenomenon. And he wrote just before dying that democracy is controlling political power, and that is its essential aspect. There should not be any political power which is not controlled in a democracy. Getting back to what Natalie was saying. And now, what's happened is that TV has become a huge political giant as a power, possibly the most important of all. And people in TV say that the same thing, and unless we're careful, the abuse will continue. And that's not just philosophy. I mean, if we actually look at the data of how public opinion is formed, I've been digging around to get that back home, what's happening in Italy as to how public opinion is formed. I give you a significant bit of data here, but this, look, in Sardinia, for example, amongst males, 92 out of 100 people get information from TV. And out of those 92, only 63 add on reading a newspaper. So pretty much 40% of the electorate get their opinion just from TV. 93%. Some of them add a newspaper, but very many of them just look at TV. Now, for women, 93% look at TV, and only 56 add on a newspaper. So, come back to what David Sassoni was saying. It boils down to the fact that TV is the way of getting news over. And that's how it's presented which is important. In the old days, you could monitor this in a sort of quantitative way, but now nobody's even looking at the quality. Agencies just, well, people looking at agency stuff, they just look what's on their screen in front of them, and if there's a lot of it, they take it. A few decades ago, I think you remember that experimentally they brought in a criterion for quantitative control of TV. In Pavia, there's somebody who's looking at all this data and collating it. There was the Second Republic and there was proportional voting, but said somebody from Christian Democracy spoke for so much time, the Communist Party so much time, the Republican Party so much time, and that's what. Nobody sort of undermined this by saying, okay, well, looking at the quality of what was said or what was said. It was just that how much time, and if anybody spoke more than anybody else, then there was hell to pay, and that's how the balance was kept by that sort of rule. And people were being very serious about it. They weren't just playing football with each other or whatever. They were taking it seriously. And with commercial TV now, and with getting involved in politics quite deeply, and digital TV, people who exploited it quickly for their own product and really got involved in politics. The system of share out of time has been imbalanced. For example, in the Olympics, all athletes being monitored on the weight of their running shoes, or what sort of shirts they were wearing, or shorts which they were wearing. So that everybody at the start of the 100 meters was pretty much on a similar position. But 10, 20 years ago, we found out that there were a whole series of athletes coming in from the East who were drugged out. It didn't matter what pants or shirts they were working, they're completely drugged out. You're checking the wrong thing. Not to mention cycling or other sorts of sports. And that's the same sort of thing, that's the comparison sort of thing which is happening on our TV. So it's no longer a question of quantitative checking of time or whatever. It's respecting certain general rules and formats. Correct information, properly informing public opinion. And that would allow them properly to carry out their voting duty or whatever. And that is a virtuous process, but it's no longer virtuous. Getting back to Popper, we're not carrying out the proper controls. David Sassoli was talking about his newspapers empirically looking to defining what a sandwich is. Just by way, for example, what is it? How can you deal with it? This was taken as a comparison. First of all, you get the news, and in the middle, you get analysis from people who disagree with the bit of news, not just governmental line, for example. So on top, you have news, criticism, and then another bit of opinion, very often from the majority or somebody else. So you've got a three-layer sandwich. So it's a layered approach. And in the it's a question of ratio then, and sometimes it's just a little bit of disagreement from the opposition in the middle. Or perhaps you could have criteria: a third to the first layer, a third to the criticism, and a third to analysis. So on the slice, the institutional slice, as you perhaps have a minister supporting the argument or a head of government supporting his own programme, we notice now that that's changing. All the ratios are changing. Berlusconi's putting forward the government line. This is running up to the elections, say. There's no analysis as to what's being done on the effects of what Berlusconi is doing might have on the country. All you do is Berlusconi's doing this, others are idiots, and there's no sort of institutional analysis. So the sandwich is deformed. So we have sent out a few points of analysis. So it's not just looking at quantity. Quantity is necessary, but it's not as sufficient. Sassoli said, well, what do we do now? I don't think it will be enough to just have a decree or some sort of legal provision, because unfortunately, when the centre-left was in government, did the same. Did exactly the same sort of thing as what they're accusing people of doing now. When they're centre-right or whatever. I mean, people have lost the opportunity of bringing in a genuine reform. And I think that the solution must be to base ourselves on a position everybody accepts. And people understanding the situation as it is more and more. And obviously you've got to come up with proposals which are well conceived and prescient and looking to the future. But the current situation cannot be sustained. Today, we have a lack of information. Or it's not just lack of information. Sometimes we do have information. We have all these agencies. We have all sorts of newspapers or journalists. But that kernel of genuine news to form public opinion is really being aggressed by people who use the media just as an instrument and use it very subtle, always subtle, but basically using a whole series of mechanisms which are typical of advertising, sort of advertising stunts of yesteryear. But they were using these in electoral campaigns in the past, but now they're constantly being deployed in the process of informing the public. I'll give you an example of something which happened no later than just a few weeks ago, on the 27th of September. And actually in October. I don't know if you remember this, but a little bit before Berlusconi spoke to the House on the 5 points, so-called then, TG Uno just sent out a note signed by the same unknown journalists. Well, sorry, as an aside here, Dante Alimenti was the Pope's journalist in the past, and he was the person who served the Pope, and there was the President of the Republic's journalist did the same sort of thing, who just followed these things. But these were the same sort of thing, the same sort of men. People are just sort of, you know, the lap journalists, if you will, preparing what's the propaganda bit for consumption. The Pope's journalist, the President's journalist did the same thing, suggesting this and getting the message over in the same way. And this was done here too, showing Berlusconi with his 1994 visage on. By the way, it's always the same photo, 1994 vintage. And the trained lap journalists just put forward this stuff with his picture. And they did it in this case too. And they had the slow motion technique, which showed somebody arriving, the big man arriving, Berlusconi arriving, with his entourage, with a firm mien, showing that he's determined to carry out his duty, sort of stuff. But the news which came out was not much. It was just the same sort of pap put out by the lap journalists. If you go back to 2004, George Bush based a lot of his electoral campaign all the same way, showing him arriving in a determined way to the White House, chin out, looking at the horizon, and a sure pace. And that's done intentionally. It's been studied to be worthwhile. He had a communications expert who said, well, this way you'll win. And he did. And it's the same expert who helped Bush, helped Berlusconi as well in the Rome campaign in 2006. So, if I can say, well, I'm bringing Niccolo Grimaldi as a marketing expert telling me what to do, I mean, if I can get a private one, it's not right to have somebody from public TV giving the same sort of advice to a public figure. That's not right. Why should you use somebody from public TV to help a particular politician? Well, what's the point, says somebody? Well, I'll tell you immediately. Journalists who are trying to show both sides of a case, opinion and a fact, say, and then analysis. I mean, sort of, that makes a sandwich. Perhaps I didn't really tell you what the sandwich was, but that's what I meant, you know, the various layers. And, I mean, it can, if it's not done properly, become improper. And this is what's happening. We're losing propriety. I think we should call people back to order and legality. I agree with what you're saying. Alessandro, grazie a Dei, and lots of other people, journalists who are there, who are doing the same sort of thing, should be called back to order. the journalists who report, the people who configure the image, all this sort of thing should come under some sort of proper order. And you shouldn't just say, for example, he did this. It should be led into and show what happened afterwards, news before, news afterwards. You should put it in its context. But when you have this team of people who deal with showing the image, it gives rise to a general problem. So I think this is a problem. The interpreters now have gone on for an extra 20 minutes and are now ceasing. Thank you.
2013. La preoccupazione di Berlusconi era quello che diceva di quello che si dice in televisione e lui diceva che esistevano delle finché verità scomode restano confinate nei libri d'inchiesta o nei giornali è meglio far finta di niente, non succede nulla. Il problema è quando finiscono sul video e quando entrano nelle case di tanti spettatori. E allora a quel punto dice, allora c'è un regime, e Berlusconi diceva sì, c'è il regime dei giornalisti, in Italia c'è un regime, ma i dittatori siete voi, i giornalisti, cioè si gira al solito la questione. Io penso comunque, e concludo perché gli interpreti devono andare via, che ci voglia una soluzione. Noi mandiamo gli osservatori, Nicolò, dell'Unione Europea, dell'OCSE, a guardare come funzionano regolarmente, se sono regolari o meno le elezioni nei paesi che sono soggetti a controllo democratico. Io penso che dovrebbero venire anche in Italia, ma non dovrebbero venire l'ultimo giorno, l'ultimo mese per verificare se sono regolari le schede, se sono regolari i timbri, se la gente non trattiene nessun elettore dall'andare a casa o meno. Ma dovrebbe controllare se è regolare, cioè se si rispettano le regole della deontologia, se si rispettano le regole di autotutela, se si rispettano le regole di autocomportamento che i politici si danno. Penso che se ci fosse questo controllo noi non solo avremmo il 70° posto nella graduatoria della libertà di informazione, ma probabilmente avremo un posto dietro lo Zimbabwe anche per quanto riguarda il discorso del rispetto delle regole democratiche e quindi della classe politica che oggi in maggioranza governa questo Paese. Grazie a tutti, ringrazio gli interpreti per la pazienza che hanno avuto e per il lavoro che hanno svolto. Grazie.